Good morning, everyone. I hope all of you are doing great. Now, I would like to introduce all to the webinar on monthly direct tax update organized by Tax Guru and Tax Connect. We have started this webinar from this month itself and will be conducting in every coming month. So I request you all to join the updates every month. I would like to introduce our speakers, Mr. Rishabh Jain and Mr. Vivek Jalan. Our first speaker is Mr. Jalan. Mr. Vivek Jalan is a qualified chartered accountant, qualified LLB and LLM. He is a chairman of Ease of Doing Business Committee in Bengal Chamber of Commerce and member at various chambers. He is a regular speaker at various professional forums on the various key area in direct and indirect taxes. Further, I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Mr. Rishabh Jain. Mr. Rishabh Jain is a chartered accountant by profession and a regular speaker at various professional forums on various key area in direct and indirect taxes. I further request all of you that during the session, if you have any queries, please write it in the chat box. All questions will be answered at the time of question and answer session. Further, I request all of you to mute yourself and keep your videos off during the deliberation. Now I request Mr. Vivek Jalan to take the session forward. Over to you, Vivek, sir.
Thank you, Priyanka. And good morning to all the delegates over here. Sham would be joining over the course of this webinar. Thank you for your overwhelming response to this seminar on direct tax monthly updates. This is our first of this kind of a webinar now on direct taxes. We also have the same on indirect taxes, on labor codes, you see in various platforms. Friends, as you know, nowadays in taxation and almost in every arena, may it be ROC, may it be insolvency, bankruptcy code, or all the sectors, steel industry, shipping industry, etc. Now there are lots and lots of changes, right? And whenever there is a change, by and large, we all get the updates. Even if we are professionals or into businesses, we get the updates on WhatsApp, on emails, through various notifications from the government also nowadays. However, it becomes very difficult to put everything together and to understand it and to get everything at one place, at one go. So that was the understanding behind starting these direct and indirect taxes monthly webinars, where in this series every month we will have a webinar of 1.5 hours where we will take you across almost all the recent amendments and changes in the subject matter. So this webinar we are doing on direct taxes, where we will cover various important topics which have been amended in this Finance Act 2021 or which would be implemented from 1st of July or very soon, right? So three important things along with other few important things we will discuss. First, as you know, new registration requires to be done for all the non-profit organizations or trusts which enjoy exemptions in income tax. The entire reassessment procedure in income tax under 147 has gone through a massive change, right? So that we would be discussing. And from 1st July, a new TDS on sale of and purchase of goods would be applicable, and which is required that all the industries, it is required that they should do change in their ERP systems and their billings and their finance processes. Along with that, we'll discuss other few provisions on TDS, on interest under income tax 234C changes, etc. So friends, first, and over with me, between me and Rishabh, who is the next speaker, we would be discussing on few topics each. So first we would discuss on the new registration for trust under income tax. Friends, as you know, in income tax, trusts, it can have various forms. That it can have a form of registration as a society, it can be a section 25 company, etc., etc. But if it is for religious purpose, medical purpose, or non-profit making purpose, or for objects of general public utility, then it can enjoy the exemption under section 11 of the Income Tax Act if it follows the procedures under section 12, 12A, 12AA, now 12AB, and section 13 of the Income Tax Act. There can be other exemptions under 1023C, section 80 of the Income Tax Act, section 35, etc., which are more or less similar, right? So the mother exemption provisions are 11, 12, 12A, 12AA, 12AB now, and section 13. Now, historically, what has happened is that there is a lot of litigations. Even recently, you would be seeing so many judgments of the apex court and the various high courts on denial of exemptions by the income tax authority to various institutions, right? Uh, very recently, even if that litigation is going on, we have handled massive litigation which has been pending for the last more than 15 years in one of the chambers of commerce, right? So we have to understand now the background on why these new registrations have come. Friends, now in the instant case which we handled in one of the large chamber of commerces, one of the oldest in the country, is that they were enjoying the exemption, you see, under section 11 since last 100 years. It is more than 100-year-old chamber of commerce, right? Why were they enjoying that exemption? Because they were considered to be an organization which was carrying on activities for charitable purposes. So what is charitable purpose? It is defined under 2 subsection 15 for religious, for the poor, etc. And the last limb, which is the most important limb, is that if you are registered and you are carrying on activities for general public utility, right, then you can be registered as a charitable organization in income tax and can enjoy the exemption. Most of the trusts, they are, if they are not for religious or service for the poor, etc., they are carrying on activities and enjoying the exemption based on this last limb, objects of general public utility. Now, in 1972, that was a year when these registrations were first thought of. Previously, all these organizations were registered under income tax. They had filed this form 10A or whatever, for 10B, whatever form was there at that point in time. No reply was received and it was considered to be deemed registered. They kept on getting the exemptions. Now, in 1972, what happened is that a new section 12AA was introduced, right? Now, what happened in 12AA was that it was mandated that by 30th June 1972, all these organizations who are enjoying exemptions, they would have to apply for the registration. And once they applied by 30th of June, within 6 months, the department would give them the registration certificate. If they do not give the registration certificate, then the organizations were deemed to be registered, right? So the department, some of the registration certificates they issued, some of the registration certificate they forgot to issue, the application was made, etc., and the exemptions continue. Now 2009 and 10, 2009-10 was a landmark year, was when an amendment was made in 2 subsection 15. You can see on your screen. In the provision to section 2 subsection 15, it was provided that any organization which carries on any activity in the nature of trade, commerce, or business, that organization would be denied the exemption, right? Irrespective of whether the income is withdrawn or it is retained. So after this financial year 9-10 assessment year 10-11, so many orders under 2 subsection 15 denying the exemption under section 11 were passed by the field formations. Even when we went to the commissioner appeals, the very moment they said कि अच्छा 215 का केस है आपका, तब तो हम ऑर्डर करेंगे, एडवर्स ऑर्डर करेंगे. So this was the thought process even at the commissioner appeal stage, and the relief was received only when you went to the tribunal. Now, many a times what happened that even at the 143(1) stage, the exemption was denied, right? Saying that, okay, gentlemen, your exemption is denied because it seems you do not carry on business for charitable purposes. You're claiming exemption under section 11, which is denied. Now, in a landmark judgment by the Calcutta Tribunal in 2011-12, in the case of Indian Chamber of Commerce, the Honorable Tribunal had quashed these orders by the CIT appeals and the adjudicating authorities, stating that the predominant objectives, okay, or the predominant activities of the organizations continue to be of charitable purpose, that is, objects of general public utility. And it was consistently applied. I would request all the participants to please put their speakers on mute. Yeah. I'll just share the screen again. Yeah. So, two doctrines were laid down by the Honorable Calcutta Tribunal in the case of Indian Chamber of Commerce. One, the doctrine of consistency, that if the objects were consistent and the activities were considered, how can you deny the exemption? And second is that dominant doctrine of a predominant objective, that the predominant objective is for public utility and therefore it cannot be denied. Now the department went on to the next thing, that okay, whether do you have registration or not have registration. Some of the chambers of commerce did not have a registration certificate, and another round of litigation started. So to take care of these, while the objects, if you see the notes on clauses in the Finance Bill 2021, the object of bringing these new registration are sought to be to check whether the exemption, whether the activities still continue to be exempt, which the organization is carrying on. And second, it is expected to be a non-adversarial regime, whereby department would not check in general on a day-to-day basis what activities you are carrying. Well, I think it is just the reverse. The government's intention is very, very clear. Even in customs, you have seen any exemption which is granted, it will be granted for 2 years, and thereafter it will be rechecked and re-scrutinized whether the exemption is required or whether it is not required. So here also it is expected that every 5 years you have to go for re-registration. Otherwise, your exemption will be denied. So you do a registration now, get a registration certificate, and thereafter, after 4.5 years, that is 1st of October 2025, you have to reapply for this registration, and that will be granted only after an assessment which is done, right? So, just an understanding of what are the provisions relating to trusts, right? Since it is such a litigated matter, let us understand first what are the provisions before going into the Form 10A. So the exemption is under section 11, where the following income shall not be deemed to be included in the total income. That is income from property held under trust, which is carrying on activity for charitable purpose. Charitable purpose, as I said, is defined under 2 subsection 15, right? So any person, any trust or any section 25 company which is carrying on the activities of charitable purpose can get an exemption under section 11 based on the conditions and based on the criterias under section 12A, 12AB now and section 13. However, there are certain criterias which need to be carefully examined. So if you make, first of all, the biggest criteria is whatever incomes you are getting or whatever receipts you are getting in that organization, that is trust or section 25 company or any such organization, at least 85% every year has to be applied for the activity for which you are registered, right? If you cannot apply 85% for the activity for which you are registered in that financial year, you can carry that amount forward for maximum 5 financial years, right? On the contrary, if you apply more than 100%, right? If you apply more than 100% in a particular financial year, you cannot carry forward the excess application in that financial year, right? So if you have an income of 100 in this financial year and you actually end up spending or providing for 105, well, that would not be, that 5 rupees will not be allowed to be carried forward in the next financial year. However, if in a financial year your income is 100, but say for example you received only rupees 60, right? 60% of receipts you have and 40% are deferred. So you can defer the application of 25% to the next financial year and up to 5 financial years, right? If in the 5th financial year also you do not apply the max or the entire 85%, then your exemption might be denied for that financial year. Donation to another trust, that would not be considered to be a application of income. If you take a loan, right, taking a loan and applying the money of the loan even for the charitable purpose or your activities, that would not be considered as application of income. Mind that only once you repay that loan, that repayment would be considered to be as an application of income. This is one of the very uh, uh, exceptional provisions where even a capital spend, right, even a capital expenditure in an asset, that would be considered to be as application of income. However, if you have spent, if you have availed the exemption and a benefit of a capital expenditure, then you cannot avail the benefit of depreciation, right? However, it has been held by various court judgments. Even we are at pains to convince the adjudicating authorities when we go for an assessment that they say, okay, capital, you will not get the benefit of depreciation. But if you have not claimed the benefit of application by when you are purchasing the capital asset, then there are various case laws, and we have also successfully represented that absolutely you can take the benefit of depreciation also. If you have your main objects, again, predominant object, you can see this judgment of the Calcutta Tribunal in case of Indian Chamber of Commerce. And it is very, very nicely explained in that judgment that if your predominant objectives are for charitable purpose, then you can have ancillary businesses also, which are supplementary to your predominant objects, but still exemption will continue to be granted to you, right? you can apply, you can invest this income which you receive in such organizations under various investment schemes which are listed under 11.5 of the Act, right? Saving certificate, post office savings bank certificate, etc., etc. You can see it on the screen. This PPT will be shared amongst all the participants, and you can go through these at your own pace, right? It is there in the Act also. This is nothing outside the Act, right? So, if you do not invest in proper channels under 11.5, then again your exemption can be denied. Now, next under section 12, again, these are the income of trust or institutions from contributions. So, any voluntary contribution for corpus or non-corpus donation. Now, again, this corpus and non-corpus is again uh, a thing which we keep on representing, and it becomes difficult many a times to convince the officers. They say, okay, for corpus donation you can have a spend through corpus fund, and for non-corpus donation you or non-corpus income you have spent it through non-corpus fund. But you see there are again various judgment we have represented successfully that you can create a complete pool. Okay, it is not that you have to bifurcate this money between corpus and non-corpus funds in your bank account. It is not possible. So you can create a pool, and out of that pool you spend and you bifurcate it in your books of accounts to show whether the application is from the corpus funds or from the non-corpus funds, right? Services made to specified persons under section 13, right? We'll come to section 13. So now again, there's a major difference between section 11, 12 and 13 and 1023C, right? So in section 11, if you are spending the money from these institutions for the benefit of the interested parties under section 13, that is the trustee, board of directors, shareholder holding more than 5%, then your exemption is liable to be denied by the department, right? But it is not that in 1023C. There you can spend it also for the specified persons. Section 12A. Now, 11 and 12 lay down the incomes or contributions which can be taken exemption of. 12A lays down the conditions for applicability of section 11 and 12. 12AB, earlier 12AA, which we will come to 12AB, lay down the procedures. Okay, 11 and 12 lay down the incomes which are exempt. 12A lays down the conditions, and 12AA lays down the procedures. Section 13 lays down the provisions relating to denial in case it is applied, the funds are applied in for specified persons. So 12A, it says that under 12A1, it says that you have to make an application under 10A, right? We'll come to the specifics. So 12A1, it is the first condition that you have to make an application under 10A. 12A1 clause AC. This is the most important clause which we must understand, and before making 10A application, these are the clauses which we must understand that which clause to apply. So 12A1 clause AC, there are 6 sub clauses under which you can make an application under form 10A, right? 12A1 is where most of us would fall, that if you are already registered, right, even then you have to apply under 12A1 clause AC subclause 1 within 3 months, that is till 30th of June. Again 12A1 AC2, the second subclause, it says that within 6 months before the expiry of 5 years, right? you have to apply under Form 10AB, right? So as I said, 31st March 2026 is the last date. Even now, if you apply for registration, again, you have to get the registration before 31st March 2026, and application should be made within 6 months of the end of the year 2020, financial year 2026. Now, one important clause, which sub-clause which has been added is that of provisional registration under 12AB. What is this provisional registration? Now, many a times what has happened in the past that after application, after 1 year or 2 years, the exemption certificate was received, and within those 1 year or 2 years, the organization, the institutions could not carry on their charitable activities, and then the promoters and the trustees would lose interest and actually close down before grant of the registration certificate itself. So this is a fast track registration. The moment you apply, within 1 month, the principal commissioner would grant you a provisional certificate of registration, right? Under 12A1 AC3, right? And within 3 years, this provisional registration would be for 3 years, and within 6 months of receipt of this provisional registration, you have to again apply for the final registration. Again, this is under 12 Form 10AB. Subclause 4. Within 6 months. Now there is a exclusivity, right? Previously, n number of times you could flip between 1023C and section 11, right? Now only once you can flip between 1023C or section 11, whatever, or 11 or 12. If you want a registration under 1023C, then you have to choose today. If you want under 10 or 11 or 12, then you have to forego 1023C. It is exclusive, either 1023C or 11, right? So within 6 months from the period under 1023C, if it is surrendered, you have to apply under 11 and 12. Very important, again, subclause 5 of 12A1AC is that within 30 days of modification of objects, say for example, a trust is registered for religious purposes, and you want to also add another charitable purpose, that is you want to give a training on musical, how to play musical apparatus, or how a musical healing, right? You want to give a training on musical healing, or you want to carry on some other activity for other purposes, which is charitable also. So you have to modify the objects of your trust in your trust deed or under memorandum and articles of association. Within 30 days from the date when you modify the objects, then you have to reapply under Form 10AB under clause 5 of section 12A1AC. Okay. Any other case under the subclause 6, any other case, you have to apply within 1 month from the commencement of the year. So these are the 6 subclauses under which you have to apply for this registration. 12A1 AC 1 2 3 4 5 6, right? So even when you are filing Form 10A, we will come to that, you have to select this clause. As of now, when you file Form 10A, then you have to select either 12A1 AC subclause 1 or subclause 6. 99% of us, it would be 12A1. 12A1 AC1. So first subclause. Again, audit and annual return, you have to, if your trust exceeds the threshold limit of exempt under income tax, then you have to file the return under ITR 7 and get it audited. However, even if you don't apply for registration, this 147 would not be done on the trust. Section 12AA, now that has been withdrawn from 1st of April 2021, right? These are old provisions. Now there was a lot of litigation on this. You see, as I told you in the very beginning, in 1972, before 30th of June, you had to reapply for registration, just like now it is happening. At that time also you had to reapply, and the department had to grant you the registration within 6 months. However, if the registration was not granted within 6 months, then the it was considered to be deemed registered, right? However, many a times in many of the cases, what the department did, that they forgot to give a registration certificate. And the taxpayers also, at that time, there was not an exclusive exemption wing like you have today. So the taxpayers also, on application, they kept on availing the exemption, which was continued to be granted. Then the department started going to court when the taxpayers did not, just hold on, the PPT has gone. Yeah. So the department started going to court, and in a landmark decision under protection of the Trust for Protection of Environment, Sports, etc. That is a landmark decision. You can see that in that it was held by the Honorable Apex Court that even though the registration certificate was not received by the taxpayer SSE, but still if he had applied before 30th of June, it would be considered to be deemed registered under 12(8)(2). Right? Now this section has been withdrawn from 1st of April. And a new section. This is the section which now takes care of this procedure under 10A. Section 12AB, right? This 12AB lays down that an application has to be made under 12A1AC. What we discussed now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 clauses, right? So you have to, the principal CIT shall make an order, right? So once you apply under 10A, you get a registration certificate under 10AC or a rejection certificate under 10AD, right? Again, as I said, even if you apply now, you get registered within 5 years, you have to again reapply. For 12(1) AC 1 and 6, right? You have to apply under 10A. You have to reapply under from clause 2 to 5, that is 2, 3, 4, 5. 12A1 AC 2, 3, 4, 5. You have to apply under form 10AB. So as of now, you have to reapply under form 10A, right? There is a time limit for the officers to pass an order. So for the current applications, by 30th of June, what you apply, the order has to be passed by the principal commissioner within 3 months, okay, of the application. For all others, provisional registration, modification of objects, etc., 2 to 5, the time limit is 6 months. And again for 6, subclause 6, the time limit is 1 month, okay. Now the question over here is that it is laid down that all the new trusts which require to be registered, they have to apply within 1 month, right, of the end of the financial year. So what now if you want to, if you wanted to get registered last year and this form 10A was not there, so an exception has been carved out that even last year, if you were incorporated or you had started your activities, form 10A was not there, you were not it was not possible that you apply. So within financial year 21-22, you have to apply and the registration would be granted to you. Section 13. These lays down 4 clauses under which the exemption can be denied to a trust. First, a trust which is registered for private purpose. So this exemption will not be granted to a private trust. and it was held by the Honorable Apex Court in the case of Devkinandan versus Murlidhar. What is a private trust? So a private trust is a trust which is for an individual or for a group of persons, right? So if you have a family trust dedicated to a family deity, that would be a private trust, and this exemption would not be applicable to such a trust. However, you have to simultaneously read the Apex Court judgment under Rana tribe, right? For a particular tribe, right, or for a particular sect, if you are making a trust, then the registration, the exemption cannot be denied to you, right? If the income under 13C, if the income is applied for the benefit of trustees or majority stakeholders, then the exemption can be denied to you. The list of those specified persons are mentioned under section 13 subsection 3. And if you make an exemption investment other than the provisions laid down under section 11, then the exemption can be denied to you. So these are the main provisions sections for the registrations and for the exemptions of trust. Similar provisions are there under 1023C, section 80G, and section 35 for scientific research, right? The same procedures are there which are defined on those sections, so you can go through that at your own pace. We are not going through that in details. So this new exemption which you are applying for under 10A, that will be granted by the CPC itself, right? And the CIT exemptions. For all other purposes, no such notification is there. The notification is awaited. Rule 17A, again, this is the rule which lays down the procedures and the documents which are required. We'll come to that. 1023C, as I said, is mainly for hospitals and for universities, colleges, etc. 80G, again, same provisions are there. You can go through, same sub clauses are there. So what are the documents which are required? Again, these are mentioned in that form 10A itself. So self-certified copy of a instrument or document creating or establishing the applicant, right? So if you are registered as a section 25 company, then you have to self-certify your memorandum articles of association. If there is a trust deed, you have to self-certify and you have to upload in this form 10A, right? Self-certified copy of the registration under FCRA or Darpan portal if you are registered over there. Self-certified copy of the existing order for registration. Now this is tricky for many of the institutions, like old institutions, old charitable organizations. They don't have a registration certificate. So how do you give them the registration certificate? I don't think for if you are continuing to be exempt, even though you don't have a registration certificate, this registration would be denied. Well, there is another document which is required, note on activities. You, along with that note on activities, you can make a write-up and you can give your brief history and the fact that that registration certificate has not even been granted to you. Or if you have gone to the court and if you have a positive order of the court, you can upload that order. In the instant case of this Chamber of Commerce, where we won this case, we are doing the same. We are just uploading the registrations, the order which we got from the tribunal, right? Even though we don't have a registration certificate. The question is now, if you don't have this registration certificate or even a registration number, right? Then what do you do? There is a place, we'll come to that form 10A. In that, your registration number and the income tax is required. So what we suggest is that in such a case, it may be an option to put in your PAN number itself, right? And again, in the note of activities, you can write a note that this is the situation and this is the order of the tribunal or any other court, and this is how we are applying for this exemption, right? Otherwise, there seems to be no other option in this case. So last 3 years financial statements, of course, if you are not registered for more than for 3 years, then even if you are registered for 1 year or 2 year, you have to upload those financial statements, right? Various other documents are there for modification of objects. You have to again upload your deed, etc. And note on activities of the applicant. So there is no format for this note on activities, but what we suggest, and you see, you can just write a small note and you can make a small table like this and upload it, where you say what are your activities, day and date from which you have done this, what is the place, what are the nature of activities, who are the beneficiaries, and the amount spent on those activities on which you are claiming exemption. So yeah, this is form 10A, right? Now we'll go through. There are around 25 odd clauses in this form 10A. So first is this PAN number and name of the assessee. This would be auto-populated. Where do you get this? You get this in the income tax website. It will be now the new income tax website will be there, but the older one, you got it under the tabs of file your return, file income tax forms. So PAN number and name of the assessee, this will be auto-populated. Full address of the assessee, this will again be auto-populated. Now this section code, this is very, very important, right? We discussed this 12A1 AC 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if you are already registered, you are reapplying, you put in 12AC1, again subclause, sorry, 12A1 subclause AC, and again clause 1, right? So you have to choose between the right section code. Nature of activities, there is a place where you select whether you are religious, whether you are for medical purposes or for objects of general public utility or any other object, right? So nature of activities you have to select. Type of constitution, whether you are a trust, society, company, etc. If you are registered with an instrument, like if you are a section 25 company, then you give the date of your incorporation and your SIN number, corporate identity number, and authority registration or incorporation number, authority granting the registration. In case of a company, you put registrar of companies or any other company. Objects of the applicant, right? What is your object? And again, if you are general public utility, you have to specifically state that you are under objects of general public utility, and this is your nature of the activity. Now, this is very, very important, clause 6, whether the trust deed contains a clause that the trust is irrevocable. You see, while there is an option yes or no, but you have to always select yes. If you select no, then the application would be rejected, right? As we have seen in the past. Now the question is, if you don't have a clause in your memorandum or articles or your trust deed on the you see irrevocability of the trust, then what do? It is suggested you add an addendum to your articles or memorandum or your trust deed and get it notarized and scan it and upload that. But please do not put in no over here. Your trust has to be irrevocable so that the exemption is granted to you and this registration form is not rejected. If you are registered under Darpan portal by the Niti Aayog or the FCRA, then you have to give the relevant details of the registration under these portals or this act. Now 8A, whether application for registration has been made in the past has been rejected. Now, again, if you have gone to the court and if you have a positive order, right? So here you have to say yes, it was rejected, and simultaneously upload the positive order of the court also, right? but it is not right to select no over here, right? Because it would lead to suppression. And if in future it is found that you have suppressed a particular information, then again there would be a litigation. Whether you're claiming exemption under 1021 for this scientific research organizations under 35, you have to state that. Again, this 9A, this is very, very important. This is the details of the key personals. Okay. So you have to give the details of the author, founder, settler, trustees, members of the society, members of the governing council, like in the Chamber of Commerce, you have managing committees, the directors or shareholders holding 5% or more of the shareholding, right? So all the details you have to give. You, and most important, now we started registering, we required the PAN number. We didn't have the PAN number of the directors. So we asked for the PAN numbers, and now some of your directors or your shareholders, they may get a little susceptible that why you are asking me for my PAN number. So this 9A, here unique identification number, here you have to put in the PAN number, right? If there is no PAN number, then Aadhaar number. If there is no Aadhaar number, then a TIN number of a foreign country or passport number, electors, photo identity, driving license, ration card number, etc. But it is only if you don't have a, if your person does not have a PAN number or a Aadhaar number, right? If your persons holding more than 5% shares or they are not natural persons, then you have to fill up 9B, right? Uh, again, 9B, you have to give the unique identification number, that is the PAN number, etc. Statement of assets or liabilities. Now this you have to give as per your last balance sheet. Which is your last balance sheet, right? This is a question which is asked in most of the forums. It is specifically provided that the last balance sheet is the balance sheet for filing of which the due date is past. So as of now, if you apply, then the last balance sheet would be the balance sheet for the financial year ended 31st March 2020 and not 31st March 2021. Okay, so you have to give the details over here for the corpus funds, liabilities, assets, etc. Other assets. So 20 is important. Income received in 3 financial years immediately preceding the previous year in which the application is made. So serial number, financial year, grants received, right, from organizations, other income, total, right? So here you have to give a details of your income for which you are claiming exemption. Religious activity details under 21A, you have to provide whether the fund or institution has incurred any expenditure of religious nature, right? And then there is a verification. The person who will sign this form would be the same person who is authorized to sign your this thing, return, right? And on grant of this registration under Form 10AC, you would get a 16-digit alphanumeric URN, unique registration number. So this is Form 10AC for you. So this is the online form, right? As I said, you go to the income tax website, go to e-file, income tax forms, and thereafter you get this screen and go ahead, select your assessment year, that will be 22, 23, and go ahead and file this form. So the same form is here. So friends, this is it about the new registration for trusts, right? There are various other important amendments in the Finance Act 2021, right? One or the income tax relaxations ordinance which was passed. One important amendment is this section 206 AB and CCA, wherein you have to deduct a TDS at a higher rate if the seller or the service provider is not has not filed his last 2 previous income tax returns. Now, practically nobody would give you the income tax returns, right, or the acknowledgement. So what we understand is that in the income tax website, there would be a utility. There are many, right, whereby you would be able to check whether your supplier or service provider has actually filed his last 2 years income tax return or not. Otherwise, this provision to comply with it would be impossible. Provisional attachment in case of fake invoices. Now you see this 281B. This is post 271 AAD, which was inserted in Finance Act 1990. Finance Act 2020. So 2020 271 AAD, it laid down that if you are a recipient or a beneficiary also of a fake invoice in GST, your GST would be denied and there would be a penalty of 200%. And in income tax here, your entire expenditure would be added back, right? There GST would be denied and here expenditure would be added back. Again, in this year in GST, Section 83 of the CGST Act that has been amended to widen the provisions of attachment. Similarly, 281B, right, has been inserted in Income Tax Act to widen the provisions of attachment, right? And the income tax department can also attach. So GST and income tax, now you see they are trying to, move parallelly. And of course, in case of dividends, it was a practical problem wherein the dividends for 234C interest for advance payment of tax, it was not possible to imagine what dividends you would be receiving. So now it is relaxed under 234C that dividend you have to account for only when you have received the dividend. You cannot take it on accrual basis. So with this, I end my deliberations over here and I hand over to Rishabh, who would be taking on the other provisions of 147, new 148A provision and the new TDS under 194Q. Rishabh, over to you.
I hope I'm audible to all. We have all seen that the income tax has gone through a mammoth changes with the faceless assessment coming in. In fact, yesterday only the department came out with a circular whereby now even ITAT representations are going to be made in a faceless manner. It is a matter of contention to understand whether this faceless assessment is in the correct spirit of law or not, at least in the case of ITAT, wherein sometimes a physical hearing to explain complex matters is required. However, that not being the subject today, the subject today that we intend to propose is the change in the income escaping assessment provisions, that is provisions for under section 147 and 148 in the erstwhile laws, and how they have gone through a mammoth changes in the recent times. So over here, we see that under the older regime, how it used to function was that the assessee used to receive a notice under section 148, which required him to file a return in compliance to the notice under 148. And after that, it was the general practice of among the practitioners to ask for reasons which were recorded or for issuance of 148. After issuing the reasons recorded by the assessing officer, which had to be a speaking order as per many judgment and court cases which have happened, the assessee used to refute the orders, and there was a lot of litigation involved, wherein 148 itself was challenged and a petition was filed in the High Court. A writ petition was filed challenging the validity of the High Court. So to make do with these provisions and to reduce the litigation, what the government thought now is that instead of issuing the reasons or the information which it had with them, later after filing the return and going into litigation, the government did a total rebound in how an assessment would be carried out, whereby it said that earlier now that whereby it said that now the reasons would be first provided, or the information which the government had would now be provided to the assessee under a separate section, section 148A, which was recently introduced in the budget 2021. And the replies of the assessee would be considered before actually issuing a notice under section 148, and then carrying on an assessment and finally issuing an order under section 147. We will go through these changes in great detail, but just to understand on an overall basis how the assessment, income escaping assessment procedure under the new regime will work, is that the AO will have to conduct an inquiry first based on the information available with him that some income has escaped assessment. Based on the results of those inquiries, now a show cause notice will be issued to the assessee under section 148A, along with the information and the results of the inquiry that AO has conducted, and asking the assessee to submit a reply as to why a notice under section 148 should not be issued for these findings. Based on the replies of the assessee, the AO, along with the prior approval of the CIT or the principal CIT, will issue a show cause notice whereby he will state that based on the information he has and the replies of the assessee, a notice under section 148 will be issued. After issuing the notice, he will ask the assessee to file a return of income as was in the earlier regime, and then carry out the assessment procedure in the manner which was carried out earlier. Now, it is very, very important for us to understand what are the points of differences apart from the procedural differences which have been brought about by Budget 2021. If we look at it, the biggest difference that is there is that now the assessee will have the reasons for which a notice under section 148 will be issued with him even before a notice has been issued, and he has the opportunity to contend the reasons in the or the information which the assessing officer has even before an assessment proceeding has been initiated. Earlier, what the practice was that if a notice under 148 was issued, more often than not, we used to see that the AO will make some additions and the matter will be litigated and will be a long drawn battle. However, now it has been seen that because of the insertion of section 148A, whereby information will be available, there is a chance that the assessee can prove his case before the initiation of 148, and thereby the case getting dropped over there. The second most important difference is that earlier there used to be a reasons to believe for issuance of notice under section 148, which has now been changed to information which is available with the assessing officer. So we see that the word information and reasons to believe are to be compared therein. The main difference between the information and reasons to believe is that reasons to believe was more based on assumptions which the assessing officer had, but now the law has made a tighter hold wherein information needs to be something tangible. If we really look at the definition of information as per Oxford Dictionary, information means facts told, heard, or discovered about someone or something. In a similar manner, as per law lexicon, the word information has been defined as an act or process of informing, communicating, or reception of knowledge. So the word information needs to be something, or the information available with the assessing officer needs to be something which is tangible and directly associated with the assessee, and he has to make an informed judgment and not make a judgment in a routine manner that whether it is a case and based on his inquiries that whether it is a case which is liable for a notice under section 148A. We have also seen in the landmark judgment of L&T versus the state of Jharkhand that wherein the Supreme Court has really analyzed the word information, to mean that it should be some facts from internal or external sources which concern the assessment. Now, information can also mean some points from the assessment records which go on to prove that some information has escaped assessment, and based on that also an assessment under section 148 or 147 can be carried out. Coming to section 147, wherein it is said that the main reason or how an assessment has to be carried out, it is very specific as to the fact that section 140, the substituted section 147 states that if any income chargeable to tax has escaped assessment, then the assessing officer can reassess or recompute for any year hereafter. What is important for us to understand is that the erstwhile section 147 and section 140 the substituted section 147, there are three main differences. One is the reason to believe, which we have already discussed. Second, the safeguarding of opening of assessment after 4 years has been done away with. That is, in the earlier laws, a addition under section 147 could only be made after 4 years if a return was not filed, or if an assessment under section 143(2) was carried out and the assessee did not disclose all the facts truly and materially. Therefore, the onus of disclosing the facts truly and materially have now been done away with. However, if we really look at the gist or the intent of law, what we believe is that even if the assessee had disclosed all material facts truly and fully in the revised provision, a reassessment under that cannot be made because of the fact that reanalyzing and revisiting some points which have already been covered in an earlier assessment would only point towards reviewing or reiterating something which has already happened, which cannot be the intent of the law, as was decided in the case of Parsuram Potteries, wherein the Supreme Court has held that the law should be that the assessment procedure should be final, and unless and until there are some facts or figures which are not correctly analyzed, then the income cannot be or the assessment cannot be reopened. Another very major change in the between the two provisions is that earlier, when an addition was made under section 147 on say reason A, and during the course of proceedings under say reason B also came into light which has escaped assessment, the assessing officer could only make additions under reason B if additions were made under reason A. Now, with the explanation being added to section 147, that the assessing officer, in my example, can also make additions under reason B, irrespective of the fact that additions have been made under reason A or not. So this has given the assessment a wider scope, whereby now all the issues which were even not recorded in the reasons in the erstwhile or were not information which was available with the assessing officer in the new regime can be analyzed by the assessing officer. So now let us understand some of the example where it will be deemed that the assessing officer has information, or some of the cases where what information really means. Explanation 1 to section 148 states that information will include any information flagged in the case of the assessee by the relevant risk management strategy formulated by the board from time to time. We all know that the government has shared into various MOUs with various other departments and other countries as well, whereby it gathers data on a real-time basis, such as data from the GST department, data from SEBI laws, data from NSDL transactions, to name a few, apart from also data from tax sharing treaties with other countries. If after analyzing these data, the government, the risk management strategy, which highlights certain inaccuracies between the information submitted by the department to the department as compared to the information available with the department is mismatching, then this can also be a category whereby it will be deemed that the assessing officer has information, and on that basis, the assessment procedures can be carried out. The second point to the explanation states that any objection by CAG will also constitute an information available with the assessing officer. Now, even earlier, when there was certain objection raised by the audit department, whether internal audit of the department or whether by CAG, this was forming a base of opening or reopening an assessment under section 147 or 148. What is important for us to understand is that what do we mean by final objections? Now, objections on point of law, as was in the case of many earlier judgments, will not contribute enough reasons to reopen an assessment. For example, in the case of Indian and Eastern Newspaper Society versus CIT, what happened was that the society had let out certain spaces to tenants and had recognized such income as income from business or profession. The internal audit of the department highlighted the fact that this was not an income from business or profession, but an income from house property. Based on this objection, the assessing officer reopened the assessment. However, it was said, when the matters went to court, it was decided against the department, wherein it was held that opening an assessment on the basis of interpretation of law by the department is not a valid case. In another case, in the case of CIT versus Lucas TVS Limited, 249 ITR 306, the Supreme Court decided that when that ATG was claimed by the assessee while computing its return of income. However, when the departmental audit happened, it was noticed that the ATG claiming parties were not a valid registered trust, and the assessing officer reopened the assessment on this basis. It was held that the reopening on factual inaccuracies was a valid ground for reopening of assessment. So we see that any final objection which are raised by the CAG on points of facts will still be available to the department for reopening of assessment. However, if these are on interpretation of laws, then a case may be fought wherein it may be said that the assessment cannot be reopened on interpretation of law, as the audit parties do not have the right to step into the shoes of the assessing authorities. Some further cases wherein it will be deemed that the assessing officer has information is when a search or a requisition has happened under section 132 or a survey under 133A. In these cases, it will be deemed that the assessing officer has information that some income has escaped assessment for the immediately preceding 3 financial year. If we closely analyze these provisions, we see that the erstwhile provisions of section 153A or 153C, which said that if a search or a seizure is carried out, then the assessment will happen for immediate preceding 3-4 years, have now been done away with, and so section 153A and 153 have been subsumed into these sections. In a similar manner, if an asset in the case of another person on whom search or seizure, or books of accounts or other documents in the case of a search or seizure for another person is carried on, and it is found that these assets or these books really belong to the assessee, based on which the assessing officer feels that some income has escaped assessment, he need not carry out the procedures under section 148A, and it will be deemed that the assessing officer has information that some income has escaped assessment. The time limits for issue of notice under section 148A has also gone through a drastic change. The earlier time limit of 4 years, 6 years, or 16 years, as the case may be, have now been replaced with 3 years in the general clause, wherein any assessment or reassessment can be opened for 3 years within 3 years from the end of the relevant assessment year, where the assessing officer has information that income has escaped assessment, and up to 10 years from the end of the relevant assessment year if the assessing officer has in his possession books of accounts or other documents which reveal that some income amounting to 50 lakhs or more has escaped assessment and they are represented in the form of assets. Thus, a conclusion can be drawn that only income which are escaped assessment, which are represented by assets, can be reopened after 3 years. To our humble submission, the law now prohibits reopening of any case after 3 years based on deemed addition of income such as deemed rent, deemed dividend, to name a few. Let us look at some recent judgments wherein which are of great implication to all of us. In the recent case of CIT versus Dharia Construction, it was recently held that reopening of assessment based on valuation report would not be a valid ground. The logic given by the department in this case was that the assessee did not disclose any fact which was untrue or which was found to be false later on. The valuation report is not a new information which has come to the light of the assessee, or it does not form a part of reasons to believe. Therefore, it cannot be said that opening of assessment on this basis is valid. In a similar case, the Supreme Court in the case of Calcutta Club Limited versus ITO stated that where the assessing officer had not followed the order of a Supreme Court or any higher authority while making his assessment under section 143(3), the same could not be a valid ground because the assessee did not disclose any fact which was factually incorrect. An error on the part of the assessing officer could not implicate the assessee for him being prosecuted under section 147 or 148. There are certain other decisions wherein it is held that if an assessment order had overlooked something which was correctly presented by the assessee, in the case of CIT versus Mozabai Limited, it could not form a ground for reopening of assessment. These are some of the major examples wherein we see that the courts have interpreted how an assessment or what constitutes information or reason to believe in the erstwhile law, and it is up to and we will have to see what constitutes information in the new law. However, we believe that since both the terminologies are closely related, these judgments will even stand the test of time in the newer provisions. Coming to some major amendments in TDS and TCS, we have all known that section 2061H was implemented by the government, wherein on receipt of sale of goods above rupees 50 lakhs, a seller needed to collect TCS. In a similar manner, in budget 2021, the government has also come out with a provision for TDS on purchase of goods. We all know that TDS on purchase or purchase and sale of goods are the flip sides of the same coin. Therefore, with this provision now coming in, a buyer who purchases any goods for an amount of rupees more than 50 lakhs shall have to collect TDS at the rate of 0.1% at the time of payment or credit, whichever is earlier. The explanation to this section also states that TDS is not required to be collected if TDS or TCS is collected under any other section except for 2061H. So the basic distinction between the TDS and TCS provisions are that the TDS provisions are first, the liability to first collect TDS is on the buyer, and if the buyer fails to do so, then the liability would be on the seller. Some of the basic questions which comes to our mind under these provisions are that whether GST or other allied expenses which are there in the invoices, whether TDS have to be collected thereon. To our understanding, since the section states that on the amount received on payment or the amount for payment or purchase of goods, GST or other components which are there will also be included while deducting TDS. While considering the total turnover, since the definition of buyer is that he should have a turnover of more than 10 crores in the previous year, we see that the entire turnover, including the turnover from services will be included. TDS need not be collected on purchase of from imports, as in because the section says that TDS is only required to be deducted while making payments to a resident. And since imports payment for imports are made to non-residents, TDS need not be collected. However, the provision of Section 195 and equalization levy needs to be kept in mind. Will the buyer deduct or will the seller charge TDS? As already discussed, the primary responsibility is on the buyer to deduct TDS. However, if the buyer fails to deduct TDS, then the responsibility is on the seller. TDS is required to be deducted at the time of payment, credit, or whichever is earlier. Let us take a situation wherein a purchase was made before 1st July, that is the date on which the TDS becomes applicable, but the payment for which is made after 1st July. Since the time of levy of TDS is on the time of credit or payment, whichever is earlier, therefore, purchases made before 1st July for which payment is made after 1st July will not attract TDS under Section 194Q. However, the buyer will require to collect TCS on such transactions since TCS provisions are being applicable from the 1st of April for this year. If no PAN is provided by the seller, then TDS have to be collected under 206AA at the rate of 5%. Will seller be responsible under Section 206C1H if the buyer does not deduct TDS? Section 206C1H states that if a transaction on which TDS is applicable and the buyer has deducted TDS, then the seller need not collect TCS. However, if the buyer has failed to deduct TCS to our humble submissions, the liability on the seller will be there to collect TCS. Will it also apply to actionable claims? Now, it is very important for us to look at the definition of goods. Goods means every kind of movable property other than actionable claims as per Sale of Goods Act. So since it is not there, since actionable claim is not mentioned in the Sale of Goods Act, therefore going by one definition, 194Q need not be collected on actionable claims. However, the definition of goods in CGST Act includes actionable claims. Therefore, a clarification will be required from the department to this effect. Will it apply to securities? Yes, as per the current definition, since securities are a goods, therefore it should apply to securities. However, in TCS, the government had come out with a clarification that transaction in securities through a recognized stock exchange will not be covered under TCS provisions. Therefore, we expect a similar kind of notification under Section 194Q. Will it also apply to immovable property? No, the TCS will not apply to to transactions in immovable property, as TDS is deductible under Section 194IA, and the definition of goods excludes immovable property per se. Will TDS also apply on transactions in electricity? Now, it is a very interesting case since electricity has been considered a good in as per custom tariff with a separate customs number being there. Therefore, from the view of the buyer, electricity is a good and TCS should be charged. But to our understanding, it should be excluded as it was excluded in the FAQs released by the department for TCS. Sale of software has always been a vexed subject. If the software is considered as a good, and then TDS under 194Q will be charged and no TDS under 194J should be charged. However, if it is considered a service, then TDS under 194J should be charged. If out-of-pocket expenses are a part of the invoice, then TDS will be charged on that because it will be considered in the purchase consideration. However, if a separate invoice has been issued for out-of-pocket expenses, then TDS should not be charged on that. So these are some of the basic questions which are there. Happy to take any other question which the participant.
Yeah, thank you, Rishad, for the extensive deliberations on 194Q and 147 new procedures. So we'll take the questions in the chat box which are there. We have a few questions and participants can ask more questions. They can type in the chat box. Okay. Now, first question from Mr. Piyush Babulal. After getting provisional registration under 12A for 5 years, whether again we have to apply for final registration? If yes, whether we need to file again Form 10A and within what time? Okay, so Mr. Babulal, the thing is that provisional registration is only for 3 years, not for 5 years. I feel what you are asking is this new registration till 30th of June under 12A1 AC1, which is for 5 years. This registration, if you already registered, you are reapplying till 30th June, that or any other new registration, that has to be renewed after within 5 years, and you have to apply 6 months before the end of the 5 years. So if you are getting registered or applying for registration by 30th of June from financial year 21-22, then you need to reapply again between 1st of October 25 to 31st of March 26. And at that time you will use Form 10AB. Mr. Manish Jain is saying, is it applicable for gratuity trust? Mr. Jain, no, the gratuity trust, you get an exemption under 1025. Okay, Provident Fund Trust, gratuity trust, this is not applicable to gratuity trust. That is more or less, that is generally a private trust. Okay. Next, Sri Lekha. She says, with respect to aggregate amount of TDS mentioned in 206AB, is it TDS done by the deductor in each of the 2 previous year, or is it the entire TDS of the deductee? It is each year. Yes, so otherwise it will go on, there will be no end. No? Mr. Manoj Modi or Mr. Hari Prakash, if invoice is raised before 30th of June 21 and payment is made after 30th of June 21, provision of which section will be applicable? Rishabh, I think you can take this.
So if Mr. Manoj, if invoice is raised before 30th of June and if payment is received after 30th of June, then the seller has to collect TCS under section 206C1H as the provisional of TDS are not applicable before 30th of June.
Right. Again, Ms. Sri Lekha, she is asking, is it correct to state that if 194Q is applicable for 206C1H? I have not understood this question. Rishabh?
Same here. I cannot understand what Ms. Sri Lekha is asking. So could you be more specific?
Ms. Sri Lekha, if you can be a little more clearer. So if you are saying that if the supplier if the customer has not deducted the TDS, whether 206C TCS will be applicable, that has already been answered by Rishabh in the affirmative. So Ms. Rizwana Khan, she says, is 20% will be applicable or 5%? That is as per 206AB or 206AA.
So can I take this question?
This is, yeah.
So
I have not understood this. Yeah.
Rizwana, the 206AB states that higher of the two rates, if both the sections are applicable, 206AB and 206AA, then the higher of the two rates in the two sections will be applicable. So in this case, if 20% is the rate as per 206AA, then 20% will be applicable.
Okay. Okay, Mr. Vijay Kumar Jain, he says, please suggest TDS deduction on reimbursement paid to employee and expense is done for the company. Please suggest provision. Yeah, this is a general question. Rishabh.
So, Mr. Jain, if TDS, if reimbursement is to the employees, then generally TDS is not applicable. As I've already stated, if the purchase bill on for which reimbursement is done, if on those bill only, if the expenses are there, then TDS will be applicable if the amount crosses 50 lakhs. However, if there is a separate bill for reimbursement of expenses, then TDS should not be applicable.
Yeah. Okay, Anurag G says, what are the forms for renewal of 12A and 80G? Please repeat. Okay, so Mr. Anurag, 12A and 80G for renewal till 30th of June for both, you have to use form 10A. Two forms will be applicable. This is a very good question. In fact, for 80G and 12A, both you have to fill two forms, right? However, 10, 23C and 11 or 12A, these are exclusive, right? Mr. Ashish Jain, he says, okay, I have received the reasons for reopening. In how much time I need to file my objections, as no date has been mentioned in the notice? Rishabh?
Section 148, Mr. Jain, I hope you are talking about the newer provisions. If it is as per the newer provision, then if you've received the reasons or information which you had, then the law says that the officer has to give you a timeline, which is a minimum of 7 days and a maximum of 30 days to file your reply. If he hasn't done that, then that notice itself can be challenged based on what I understand.
Yeah, Mr. Ashok Jha says, sir, how seller will deduct TCS, as he will come to know that purchaser has not deducted TDS only after payment is received by him. Please advise. Mr. Jha, your concern is genuine. And Rishabh.
So TCS is only required to be collected on after receipt. If suppose the bill was for 100 rupees and TDS on the same has been deducted, then the payment would be of 99.9, and the seller will know if TDS has been deducted. Now the question which arises is that he will only come to know whether the returns have been filed for TDS once the TDS return is filed. So the question, so while receiving the payment, the seller knows that the TDS has been deducted, and therefore he can collect TCS accordingly.
Right. So just to add on to this, you see that you can, or we are advising all our clients that you should at least take a declaration from all your customers, at least your major ones. This would be applicable only to those 50 lakh plus turnover customers. So you should take a declaration, say, by sending a mail to all of them that you see they will deduct this under 194Q, the TDS, right? Because it is their primary responsibility. Even if you pay TCS, post they're not deducting, their expenditure will be disallowed and added back. So this you should state in your letter to your customers, and that will act as a deterrent for them for not deducting TDS. Okay, Ms. Srilekha says, please clarify if a new registration has to be applied in the current year. Will registration be granted from the current year or the next year? Current year, I clarified this. I think you are saying that whether if in the last year you are registered but you could not file the form, now you are wanting to apply. So exception has been carved out in this. You can apply for current year, and from the current year itself you will be granted the registration. Mr. Avinash says if the seller is deducting TCS, collecting TCS under 206C1H, even though the buyer has to deduct TDS under 194Q. Yeah, Rishabh.
So this is the anomaly on the seller's part. The legal law position is that if the buyer is deducting TDS under 194Q, then the seller need not collect TCS under section 206C1H.
Correct.
With respect to the aggregate amount of TDS mentioned in section 206AB, it is TDS done by deductor should be considered, or it is the entire TDS amount of deductee as per his return. Ms. Srilekha, what I understand from your question is you're trying to ask that the limit of 50,000 will be for the deductor or the deductee. The section 206C AB states that the limit of 50,000 is per deductee for the deductor. So if in the previous 2 years, individually in each year, the deductor had deducted a TDS of more than 50,000 rupees for the deductee, then the provision of section 206C AB will be applicable.
Yeah, go to the next, Rishabh.
Yeah, Mr. Shyam Sundar Lohia, after following 148A provision, considering the reply from assessee, assessment is reopened. How shall get relief in final assessment order, as AO already considered relevant matter in this regard to this issue? So, sir, section 148 is basically to provide you with the information that is there, and after that he will make an assessment which was being done in the earlier manner. The only objective of 148 is to try and reduce the litigation, so that the information, if something is for a clerical reason or for a reason which is not valid, can be dropped at the word go itself. So if after considering the reply of the assessee, the assessing officer still decides to reopen the assessment, then the normal assessment procedures can be followed, whereby submissions can be made and facts can be presented if required to prove that what the information which the assessing officer had, no income has escaped assessment.
See, over here, just to add on, now the question is this 148A order. Along with 148 notice, 148A order also has to be given. And the question now is, if you are not satisfied with this 148A order, what are your remedies? So over here, one point which I would want to make is that you have two remedies. One is that you have the writ remedy, of course, but generally it is not a good idea to go for a writ remedy instantly. Go for the 147, let it be reopened, and then when you are challenging the 147 order, then you take this ground also as ultra vires or etc. Therefore, tomorrow when you go to the High Court, if at all, you can always say that I had this point from the very beginning, but I used the alternate efficacious remedy, and I am coming to you from as per the procedure. I am not coming directly to you, right? So herein, if you follow this strategy, possibly no, your litigation would be on a stronger ground. Yeah, Rishabh, next. Okay, next is a GST question. I'll take, if the SSE is in construction of road work and acquire tender through bidding process to central government of NHAI in defense sector, is rule is applicable if sales is more than 50 lakhs. Also is applicable GST e-invoicing is applicable in this case. See, if you are in construction of road, okay, number one, for e-invoice, 50 lakhs is not the criteria, 50 crores is the criteria, right? So GST for 50 lakhs is not applicable. for construction of road, that is a service which which is rendered, right? So 194Q will not be applicable, neither will 206C1H be applicable in this case. What would be applicable is 194C, right? Which NHAI would be required to deduct. Rishabh, your views on this?
I completely agree with you.
Yeah. Okay. Next is trust already got registered 12A certificate before 31/3/2021. So whether they are mandatorily required to apply again, if not applied within that date, what consequence will arise? See, my view here is that if you have got that 16-digit URN, alphanumeric unique registration number, no need to reapply. But if you have not got this URN, then you should reapply. Okay, Mr. Manoj Modi, last two questions are there. While deducting TDS under 194Q, GST amount should be included in the calculation. Is it correct? Rishabh has already clarified this. Rishabh?
So the section 194Q states that the payment received for purchase, the payment made for purchases, so payment includes GST amount. Therefore, while computing the total amount on this TDS is required to be deducted, GST amount has to be considered.
Same was there the case in TCS, right?
1H. Same as in 2061H.
Okay, so last question. With respect to 206 AB CCA, is there any utility provided by IT return to verify if the vendor or customer has filed his income tax return in the previous year? So yesterday only we were discussing this in another workshop which we were having. As of now, no, but it is expected that a utility would come in, or like Rishabh said, that possibly in the income tax website, just like GST, you can check whether the party has filed his last two returns or not. So with this, we close this webinar. Thank you very much for joining. The PPTs would be sent on your mail IDs, those who have joined this webinar. And on our YouTube channel, we would be uploading the recording of this video also. You can access it over there. Next month, again, we would come out with the next webinar, the second in the series of monthly updates, where we would be discussing the income tax return related new provisions, new aspects of income tax return, new TDS audit, the income tax audit, and other new developments in income tax and direct taxes. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you, Rishabh sir and Vivek sir, for your valuable deliberation. And I thank all the participants for joining. We will be conducting this kind of webinar every month. We hope that you all will join and make our session successful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.